If you are here, you wish to know. Welcome to What's News This Week, a weekly series where I speak about different releases that I found interesting so I could keep up on you also. Don't miss out on new video game releases and stuff to watch. And the first thing we're gonna talk about today is The King is Watching, which is a tower defense, kingdom building simulator. You will choose what buildings to build in your kingdom, and a wave of enemies will go and attack you, and you will have to protect your kingdom against enemies that try to conquer you. And there's different events that will happen, and you'll have to make different choices. You choosing what kind of king you are, and how exactly you will be protecting your kingdom with what abilities and magic and policies. So this could be like a fun video game experience. Wuchang Fallen Feathers, Chinese game. Developers made a game based on their folklore of their region, something about bird people. There was a whole lore video about this. There's people that are more blessed by magical birds, and they are constantly living, and some, while being immortal, turn into monsters, and you as one of the people need to defeat evil and make sure that there will be no more corruption. That's why you fighting. Surely it will be a fun game, and I'm looking forward to it. It's a great Villainess strategy of Lily. So it's a strategy RPG where you play as a villainess and you want to conquer the whole fantasy kingdom, and there will be a giant amount of characters and different units that you will have to conquer and capture in order for them to fight on your side. Okay, we're gonna embrace villainy and be the greatest villainess that ever was. Alright, that sounds fun. Hotel Galactic. If you watched Spirited Away and never wanted to have your own hotel for supernatural beings, you can be a manager of that hotel. You're choosing how to make rooms, who to hire for a job, which kind of spirits will be taking care of other spirits. Also, of course, it's about collecting wood and stone, because from what else you will gonna build all this furniture. And this game about chilling and having fun. No Sleep for Kaname Data from Ace the Somnium Files. It's a third game in the series. I played the first one. The second one was a spin-off that I didn't get my hands on yet. And this one is the third one, where the idol girl that was in the previous games was captured by aliens, and now our detective Kaname Data, with his AI in his right eye, needs to save her. Find a way to save her, find a way how to get her from the moon station or something. Okay, it's gonna be more puzzles and strange shenanigans that are gonna happen. Alright, Ghost Killer. It's a movie about an assassin, a professional assassin that died, and his spirit possessing a college girl, and now they're working together in order to make sure that he would get his revenge and could pass on. The premise is hilarious. The young girl got abilities of a professional killer and seeing this ghost, surely it will be one fun comedy, action comedy. The acclaimed drama returns. South Park Season 27. Are they gonna finally release the whole season, not in different specials, because they didn't like Comedy Central and stuff? Considering what a turbulent times it were in real life, I suppose there will be a lot of jokes. There will be a lot of jokes. Is South Park fighting with Canada? Is that what's happening? What is going on? Definitely some stuff will happen in South Park Season 27, and it would be hilarious. Osiris. A bunch of American soldiers got transported to space station, and aliens want to eat them. American soldiers want to survive, when they will fight for their survival against aliens. It all reminds me of either Doom 3, because creatures looks exactly like from Doom 3, or Prey, at least the old Prey, not the new Prey from Arcane, but old Prey about the Indian guy that got transported to a space station, and they finding a survivor there, they uniting, and they fighting against aliens that also want to destroy Earth. Okay, the premise one already, maybe I'll watch it. And unfortunately, that's all I found interesting this week. So, if you have the channel to live and grow, please support me here on all social media, share my videos with anyone using for sharing, do jump platforms from YouTube to Twitch to Trovo to Blue Sky to Twitter to whatsoever. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next videos and streams. Bye.